Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to welcome you to EPA's Environmental Science Seminar Series. This time we're going to be taking a look at the Environmental Protection Act in action 1 year on, with special guest speakers Professor Kate Auty and Mark Rossiter. I am Mark Patrick Taylor, Victoria's Chief Environmental Scientist at the Environment Protection Authority. I'll be hosting today's session. But I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Aboriginal people as the first people and traditional custodians of the land on which land and water on which we live, work and depend. We pay respect to Aboriginal elders past and present. As Victoria's environmental regulator, we pay respect to how country has been protected and cared for by Aboriginal people over many tens of thousands of years. We recognise the unique spiritual and cultural significance of land, water and all that is the environment, and the continuing connection and aspirations for country of Aboriginal people and traditional custodians. As part of the seminar, we encourage people to post questions and also to support other people's questions, as we will answer the most popular. Please take a few notes in regard to this live stream event. Please be patient with technical difficulties. The structure of the event will feature an introduction by myself, a presentation by Professor Kate Auty, followed by a presentation by Mark Rossiter, a panel, question and answer, and a final conclusion. This event will be recorded live, so if you need to leave early and miss any parts of the session, you can watch it later via the EPA website. The session has live closed captions to ensure that it's accessible for all. We will provide time at the end for question and answers, and we will welcome people to please provide their questions in the questions box at the bottom of the screen. We will open the question and answer section now, but we will respond to the questions after the presentations. We'll try to get to as many as we can, and all questions not answered today will be responded to via email at a later time. Please provide your contact details so we can respond to you. So on to the topic for today. We are here to discuss the Environment Protection Act in action 1 year on. Victoria's Environmental Protection Act 2017 came into effect on the 1st of July 2021. This was the largest change to Victoria's environmental laws in half a century, giving EPA increased powers, emphasising a preventative approach to regulation and introducing Australia's first criminally enforceable general environmental duty. As we approach the first anniversary of this major change, we intend to cover as part of this seminar series what we have delivered on to date, what the Act means for our future, and where there is more work for us to do. Speaking to these topics will be Professor Kate Auty, EPA Victoria's Governing Board Chair, and Mark Rossiter, Executive Director for Operations. It is with great pleasure that I introduce our first speaker, Professor Kate Auty. Kate is a Professorial Fellow at the University of Melbourne, a Director of the Urban Climate Change Research Network's Oceania Hub, and a member of the writing team with Future Earth Australia and the Australian Academy of Science. Kate has extensive experience with environmental and climate issues. This includes her work as the Commissioner for Sustainability and the Environment in the Australian Capital Territory. Kate is also a member of the Victorian Bar. She has worked extensively as a magistrate and coroner. Kate continues to volunteer with community, environmental and sustainability groups in Northeast Victoria. Professor Auty is Chair of EPA's Governing Board and has a wealth of experience and knowledge. Please join me in welcoming her today. Kate, it's over to you and I look forward to your words.
Thanks very much, Mark. And thanks everybody for giving us your time today. We know that it's cutting into your own busy schedules, but we think it's really important to talk to you about what we've been doing with the EPA's new role and our new Act. Could I just add my words to the acknowledgement that Mark was able to bring to you just before, because I would like to acknowledge Aboriginal people's contemporary aspirations and urge everybody who thinks about these matters to consider how we might make sure that contemporary aspirations are met in things like the Uluru Statement and also in treaty and the Voice to Parliament. I suppose one of the things I'd like to say to start with is that you are all here because you know that we have a new piece of legislation, and it is about prevention rather than just rehabilitating the environmental space. You also have been watching, no doubt, with considerable interest how we've been thinking about engaging the community in the role that we see unfolding under the new Act. And you've been considering how we've dealt with emerging challenges and bringing data to the whole evidence-based consideration for decision making. Some of you will have less of an awareness about what the Governing Board is doing. And of course, what we have is a CEO in Lee Mises and a board which I chair, which have similar roles, but also we operate differently. And I think it's important to just talk about the role of the board just before I say anything about the Act. The board is a new creation, essentially, with this new role as the EPA understands its functions. And our role is, of course, to engage in risk management, risk assessment, thinking about governance, and wondering about how we might make sure that we contribute to the role of the EPA under this new agenda. If you've got any questions about the board's role, please do have a look at it in the legislation, because we're certainly there with those requirements. All of you will also know that, of course, the objective of the EPA under the new legislation is to protect human health and the environment by reducing the harmful effects of pollution and waste, so from pollution and waste. And that, of course, that involves monitoring, identifying, responding, eliminating, advising, liaising and promoting, all of which come into what we understand to be the way that we operationalise that objective. Amongst the things that we've been doing in the 12 months that we've been considering our new role, of course, and prior to that, has been engaging in a massive transformation agenda and bringing to the EPA a new way of structuring its role. And we have, as some of you will know, a new organisational structure, and we've broken that up into strategy, quality, operations, legal, science, public affairs and corporate services. I just want to talk briefly about that, because I think it's important that you understand that under the strategy division, we have a number of components, including policy, the enablement, permissioning, business improvement, Aboriginal strategy, and data analytics and intelligence. And under operations, and you're going to hear from Mark Rossiter and his team members, we've broken that up into metro, regional and regulatory, and we're taking the view that our regional component of the operations of the organisation are extraordinarily important and critical. Under legal, we've now brought everybody who has a legal interest in what goes on in the EPA to a direct report with the CEO. And that's meant that we've taken people out of other divisions for the purposes of doing what we know we need to do to meet our objectives. And in relation to that, you will see that under operations, we have investigations with a crime branch, surveillance and investigations themselves, but that has a direct link to the way we understand that legal role and those obligations. Which brings me to something that I think is really critical to the new legislation, and it's the general environmental duty, which you've heard Mark refer to briefly, that's Professor Taylor refer to briefly, talking about the way in which that has in fact now given us the power to prosecute in a criminal manner, and there are offences that carry penalties that are in fact criminal penalties. And we've had a lot of questions about the GED, and there'll no doubt be some further comments from our team as they talk this afternoon. With the GED, there's been interest in what it actually means. And of course, it means that people have to minimise the risks, and they have to do so as far as is reasonably practicable. This is not an opportunity for me to give anybody legal advice, but I'd urge everybody to have a careful look at Section 25 of the Act and think about what it means to use and maintain plant and equipment and processes for the purposes of meeting that GED, and think about what it means for us to be expecting of you that there will be care in substance handling and the other associated requirements. The interesting thing about the GED is that, of course, everybody's concerned about it to the extent that they want to know what it means. But it's not the only thing that we want you to take away from the new legislation. We also want you to think about how the community can be involved really actively in getting to a stage where we've preemptively considered what a GED might mean and what it might be. And one of the ways in which we're hoping the community will be engaged with that is through better environmental plans. Now, if you have a look at where they show up in the legislation, it's in part 8.2, and I'm not going to take you all through that. But if we're thinking about what a better environmental plan might mean, it does mean that we're going to be engaging the community. It does mean that the community will have a role, and it's not just about individuals and enforcement. And of course, the thing that sits under all of this, which is critically important, but not what I would describe as an enforceable attribute of the legislation, are the principles that show up in part 2.3. And these principles are, as you will all probably be very well aware, about integration. It's about proportionality, about prevention, sharing responsibility, thinking about how we make sure that the polluter pays, managing waste through the hierarchy, which of course is critical to what we do, ensuring that we're engaged in evidence-based decision-making, maintaining the precautionary principle as core to what we do, ensuring that equity underpins the way in which the EPA acts and the community responds, and also thinking about accountability and conservation, which extends to biodiversity and ecological systems. Those principles sit under what it is we want to see happen with the new legislation and the way that everybody embraces their capacity to meet the challenges and do so in a way that gets us to the objective, which is to produce the harm that flows from pollution and waste. One of the other things that's really critical to us and that's come through our understanding of our role under the new legislation is thinking about the way we involve the community in the liaison that needs to happen. And some of you might have been part of that with the Cherry Lake work. Some of you might be part of that with what's happening out at Bulla. Some of you might be engaged in that through your regional communities. And we'd be urging everybody to think about what a better environmental plan looks like from the point of view of that sort of community engagement. But our people are out there leaning into the issues. Amongst the things that we're also really interested in engaging in an ongoing way, and we've had really good feedback about it with this new legislation, is how we embrace the role that local government plays in respect of the environment. And many of you will know the role that the Opals are playing. We've had good feedback about that, and we've had people asking us to consider how we might expand it and extend it. If you come to one of the last things that I want to talk about before I throw to Mark Rossiter and his team, who are going to take us through much of this in greater detail, it's about how we make sure that we are an evidence-based organisation bringing data to the forefront of decision-making. And if I just give you one little example of this, it actually plays out quite recently with some conversations that took a while to get going with Australia Post, where we're now using their mail delivery service for the purpose of understanding what might be the pollution issues in some of the regions. And in fact, they're helping us with the data collection. So at that level, we've picked up the ways in which we can partner others to embrace what we know we need to do. And we've added that to our concerns about ensuring that we bring intelligence to what it is we're collecting by way of data. And that's, of course, involving all sorts of new technologies, and they're not so new anymore, but drones and certainly surveillance. We understand that with this legislation, there will continue to be interest in this conversation, and that's one of the reasons why Professor Taylor and his team have brought this seminar series to the forefront. Can I urge you, while we're sitting here thinking about all of these issues, to be engaged in the question and answers? We're going to have ample time to do it. I've contracted the time that I'm talking so that we can make sure that you do. And if you've got those questions, even if we don't get to them today, we will pick them up and run with them at a later stage, as Mark Taylor has said. Having made all those comments about the legislation from the point of view of myself and the board, let me just say that we understand the community's aspirations for the EPA, and we are working to make sure that we respond in a proactive and positive way to them. Mark Taylor, I'll come back to you if it is to you that you want to then throw to Mark Rossiter, but otherwise it's just straight over to Mark Rossiter, who is, of course, the Executive Director of Operations, and he's got with him some of his extraordinarily expert team in Duncan, Rachel and Kelly. So either to Mark Patrick Taylor, that's your name tag, Mark, or to Mark Rossiter.
Thank you very much, Kate. And I'd just like to introduce Mark so the audience knows who he is and the great work that he has been doing in the last couple of years for the EPA. So Mark Rossiter is our Executive Director of Operations at EPA Victoria. Before joining the EPA, Mark was Executive Director of Operations and Chief Corporate Officer at the Victoria Building Authority, Manager of Stakeholder Strategy and Manager of Air Navigation Service Strategy at Air Services Australia, Head of Safety at Jetstar Airways, and Manager Safety Oversight at the Civil Aviation Safety Authority and Human Factors Specialist at Qantas. The Operations Division leads EPA's frontline regulatory response to detect, prevent, and investigate harm to the environment and human health from pollution and waste. The division does this by engagement and education, inspections and monitoring, surveillance and investigations, and enforcing duty holders to comply with the law. The core functions are compliance and enforcement, education engagement, investigations, high-risk site cleanups, compliance programs, field specialists, waste transport, infringement management, financial assurance and levies, preventative programs, and incident coordination. It's an enormous portfolio for Mark, but he delivers it with great skill. Please join me in welcoming Mark to his seminar to talk about the new Act.
Thank you, Mark. Says Mark. Hopefully it's not too confusing with all these marks. So I also would like to just open by acknowledging traditional owners. So I am coming to you from Wathaurong country today, or Wadawurrung country, depending on the particular dialect. In fact, there are 21 that I could find particular connotations of the lands upon which I'm coming to you from. And for me, that always reminds me of the depth of that history and the importance of it, and how fortunate we all are to be current custodians of this wonderful land that we're also connected to. So with me today, I have Kelly Lockman, who's our Regional Victoria Area Director, Rachel Galana, who's our Metropolitan Area Director. So between them, 7 regional offices around the state, and also Duncan Pendry, who's our Director of Regulatory Services. So has a responsibility for a number of quite public-facing systems and processes and service-based functions within EPA. I'm seeing a slide that says new legislation in action. Can I just check that that's what someone give me a thumbs up and say that's what everyone else is seeing too? Okay, good, thank you. So to start, I will just do a very quick reset in terms of what is it that happened last July and where did it come from and where do we find ourselves today. So I won't rehash all of the go live readiness conversations we had with many of you prior to July last year, but just a reminder of what happened last July, and that the Act introduced great flexibility and proportionality to risk through, and particularly the general environmental duty, as the chair has mentioned. Its intent was to provide clarity and certainty for business and community. And of course, prior stakeholders had said many times they wanted more transparency. The Act introduced a number of reforms to ensure more environmental information is effectively available, to support good environmental decision-making, and to provide access to information about regulatory decisions and indeed the state of the environment more broadly. It allows space, the Act. Its nature is outcome-based, its nature is flexible, its nature is duty-based, and so it allows space for environmental justice initiatives. It allows space for innovation in industry, and it allows space for very dynamic decision-making in relation to regulatory matters. That is best practice. When it comes to regulatory practice, that's what best practice looks like, and you'll find in the more mature regulatory environments around the world, that is exactly the construct that is in place today. We are the envy of many states and territories with the legislation that we have in place. We are the envy of many other nations with the legislation that we are in place. And we are very, very fortunate to have had this legislation introduced by the minister last year. And now we find ourselves almost a year in. And as the chair also mentioned, there was a large modernization of EPA that went hand in glove with the change of the Act, including indeed the introduction of the governing board. So next slide, thank you. So a very simple example here about the focus on harm. This is the fundamental shift in terms of the Act and the world that we find ourselves in now, is this focus on harm, which requires us really to rethink our perspective on risk and the way in which harm arises. It does mean starting with a source of harm, And when considering this in the context of assessing compliance from an EPA perspective, of course, if you take this very simple example here, at one end, you can see in the right-hand end, there's harm to a waterway caused by a release of pollution, but moving back up the chain of events that cause the pollution to the left, we can see that there are steps that could have been taken to cut that pathway and prevent the harm. It is that prevention that is the focus of the new Act. So under the 1970 Act, it was whether or not you polluted the environment. Risk was therefore viewed in terms of assessing the scale of actual harm or potential harm. And we drew on science and technical expertise in understanding the environment and assessing those risks. And quite frankly, we spent an awful lot of time doing that. We spent a lot of resources doing that, and very often to trying to get to a reasonable point of something being in the public interest that would sometimes evade you. It was a much more difficult operating environment for us operationally. Whereas now, the degree of flexibility and what it affords the EPA in terms of helping us to do our jobs has made it quite a different place to be. We're still grappling with that, and we're still we have our training wheels on somewhat still, but I'm very, very impressed with how quickly we've come to where we are from the 1st of July last year. So the absolute cornerstone, next slide, thank you, is the general environmental duty, and it is intended, as it says there, to be enduring, flexible, and fill regulatory gaps where no specific requirement exists in current legislation. It is an absolute safety net for Victoria's environment, and as I say, we're very proud of it. In terms of our approach, next slide, thank you. We now find ourselves determining what is reasonably practicable in relation to the minimization of risks, and these are some of the things that we have regard to. A good way to think about this is an industry and community facing side of this and a regulator facing side of this both needed to shift quite substantially. So industry have had to move, and they've done some fantastic work, and we see fantastic work all the time. We saw great work in preparedness for this. We see fantastic work since in maturing systems and processes around the identification of risk. That's quite a big change for industry and for community. For the regulator, it's actually it's an easier and a harder place to be. So it affords you greater powers, it affords you greater flexibility, but it puts you in a very dynamic position. So instead of just looking for something that a rule specifically articulates and checking whether or not that is the case, which in large part was the 1970 Act, it's a very dynamic environment, and you never quite know what's going to come through the door. Kate spoke a little bit about better environmental plans. I also would advocate strongly for consideration towards better environmental plans and putting our minds together as one Victorian community to see what better can look like. Better is the very important aspect of better environment plans to think about. It's about putting in something in place that can demonstrate equivalence in terms of environmental outcomes at an absolute minimum by being innovative about the way in which we address environmental risks. So these, as I say, are some of the things that we think through, and this is the approach that we take to our work on a day-to-day basis. That has required a lot of internal change. It has required a lot of internal procedural change and process change, but also cultural change and training for teams to give them the ability to work with industry to make dynamic determinations in relation to the okayness of things that are being inspected or things that are being assessed on a day-to-day basis by our officers. So a very, very big shift for our team. Again, I am very, very proud of the team and the work that they've done to get themselves into the space that they now find themselves. Rachel and Kelly will give you a little bit more on that day to day. They're dealing with those teams very, very closely. So they'll have some interesting case studies to share with you around what does this act in action actually look like from a day-to-day perspective. Thank you. Next slide. Thank you. Next slide. Thank you. So I will at this point hand over to Duncan Pendry, our Director of Regulatory Services, to chat through some of the things that we can do. I might just set this up by saying you can see from what's on the screen in front of you there that we're certainly not sitting on our hands. And what you can't see is matters that are still washing through from the previous act. So this isn't a full picture in terms of our activity base, but it gives you a really good perspective around the things that we are working on and the tools that we are using, what the scale of that looks like under auspices of the new act. These are what the numbers look like. And on the right-hand side, you can see there's a very simple depiction there of the way in which we go about applying our compliance and enforcement policy. So our compliance and enforcement policy stretches very far from education right up to the pointy end of the judicial system and everything in between. And we try to use every aspect of that at all points in time, with the center of the crosshairs pointed squarely at the prevention of harm. So the decisions that we are making operationally on a day-to-day basis are fundamentally premised upon a shared objective and an absolute heart-held belief by EPA staff to try and prevent as much harm every day as we possibly can. These are the tools we use. This is the way in which we go about it. This is the scale of it and what it looks like. Rest assured, this is what we are thinking about, and this is the way in which we are addressing harm on a day-to-day basis. So that said, Duncan, I will hand over to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks for being here today, everybody. So I'll just speak a little bit to this slide and then quickly move through. We haven't got a lot of time for all the slides we have. So the EPA Act provides us with a great deal of discretion to deal with non-compliance and risks of harm to human health and the environment. And as you can see, it's a graduated scheme going from support to comply down the bottom of the triangle to applying the full force of the law to various serious offences. So the actions that we've taken this year are set out in terms of the numbers in the table. And you can see we've taken a strong focus on support to comply as we and everyone else gets used to the preventative-based approach under the new Act. So while it says greater than 2,000 interactions, those 2,000 or so are the ones we've recorded officially in our systems. There's been many more interactions than that, obviously, across the year. We've also undertaken more than 3,600 inspections at sites and businesses across the state that led to those actions that are set out in the table. So we've taken action all the way up through the triangle during the year. Next slide, please. So one of the new attributes of the Act is the requirement to track all reportable priority waste, which is the more serious waste that could cause serious harm to the environment. And so what was built up until prior to the 1st July was a new electronic waste tracking system, which went live on the 1st July. And to date, we've had 8,000 plus users of Waste Tracker. And the Act requires producers, receivers and transporters of waste. They have obligations to report to us every movement of reportable priority waste in the system. And the system provides that support for them to do that. So while we've been getting used to the new Act, the law commenced on the 1st July and the system went live and has worked very, very well. There's been only a small couple of outages for a brief period of time, but on the whole, it's performed very well. And our producers, transporters and receivers have been actively engaged with it, as you see. While it's worked well, there are improvements that we want to make to it. And we had a series of workshops with the industry, 6 workshops, to understand what things we would do to improve its functionality. And we've embarked on a waste tracker enhancement project to build serious investment into some uplift in terms of the system's performance to help be the most efficient system it can be for the industry. So we'll talk about some of that in a little while. Next slide, please. Might hand over to, is it Rachel?
Thanks, Duncan. And hi, everybody. Really pleased to be here with you and thanks for joining this presentation. I'm Rachel Golano, the Melbourne Metropolitan Area Director in Operations. Kelly and I will just talk you through a couple of case studies that show EPA in action at the local level in all our staff from our regional offices who are out there applying the law, acting as the regulator, using all our tools in terms of the regulatory toolkit and our influence to try and get better environmental and human health outcomes and prevent harm from pollution and waste. So really, this is just a couple of examples out of the thousands of interactions that Duncan mentioned, but it shows the new legislation in action. Our first one is around municipal landfills servicing less than 500 people, and this really illustrates a way of proactively engaging with that sector in order to transition them to a new permission requirement, because under the 1970 Act, they didn't need a permission. And they were largely unregulated. We didn't know how many of them there were. We had some information, but not a whole lot of information. Under the 2017 Act, they need to have a permit. We've assessed that risk as being a medium risk, medium complexity activity. So a permit is in that sort of middle layer of permissioning under the Environment Protection Act. We also have registrations at the lower end and operating licenses at the upper end. But what we did was engage with that sector, built awareness, provided guidance, ran workshops to support their transition into a permission. Followed that with some compliance activity around inspections and drone flights. And what we found was that capability of that group had increased. This permission is not the only thing that we use to regulate and make sure we're preventing harm from pollution and waste. Obviously, we have the general environmental duty, which is really critical to preventing that harm moving forward. So it's using the permission, but also the general environmental duty and the significant skills that our people have to work with duty holders and the community to help to prevent harm. So we explored a range of mechanisms to bring this group over the line, and that's the outcomes so far. I might just move to the next slide to give you the flavour of a couple of different ones. This one involves a chemical spill that occurred. It was a chromium trioxide acid spill. It's a pretty nasty sort of chemical, toxic, corrosive, carcinogenic. It's got a lot of industrial uses, so used in a range of coating and other processes. We received a notification from that company around the spill and undertook an inspection, got the notification on a Monday at 11 a.m. We're out there at 12:30, an hour and a half later. Speaking to the officer, obviously the immediate risk in the spill was contained at the time, but we have issued a number of notices using that really important general environmental duty to get the duty holder to implement a risk-based monitoring program, make sure they've cleaned up the waste that was produced. But under the old Act, we didn't even find out about some of these unless the community reported it. There was no requirement, it's not a permission site. We now receive that information. This is critical because not only do we then get to follow up with the site and follow up on their broader risk controls and making sure it's not just about the incident, but about how are they controlling risk associated with these types of chemicals and chemical waste broadly. But we also then can use that data to inform industry or sector-specific programs, hazard-specific preventative programs, so that that data that Kate mentioned in her slide is really critical. Might just move through to the next slide. The last one that I'll talk about and then hand over to Kelly is provision of information and training to reduce risk. Now, we don't advocate just providing information and training to control a risk without considering a whole range of other controls, engineering controls, can it be eliminated, those kind of things. But the information, instruction, training under the general environmental duty requirements is critical for us to implement and bring to life those other important engineering controls and make sure that that system is working to prevent harm. In the past, in the old legislation, we couldn't issue notices or require duty holders to provide that information, instruction, training. We've done that for a particularly large company that employs subcontractors, and asked that they, through notice, deliver training and information so that those contractors can undertake the activity safely and implement those controls. So I guess that gives you a bit of a picture on the power of the general environmental duty on some of the work that our people are doing out there. And there are plenty more examples. I'll hand over to Kelly now to talk you through a few others. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel, and hello to everyone. I'm very proud to say I'm working on Yorta Yorta and Pangarang lands in the northeast of the state. And I'm quite new to the EPA team, so very keen to echo Mark's comments. I'm so very proud of the work that our team's doing at the moment. And I get the privilege to talk to someone else's case studies today. But this first one is a great example of a proactive investigation. So it relates to the site of an underground petroleum storage system at a bus depot. And under the old Act, we really wouldn't have had a lot of opportunity to step in here other than once we'd proven that there'd been some contamination. But the new Act offers us some great opportunities. And we had an officer that reasonably believed that there may have been some contamination at this land. And the land was located quite close to some recreational community areas. So using the new Act, our officers liaised with the duty holder and asked them to do some of that work, that check in and make sure that the land was free from any sort of contamination. And under the Act, they've got a duty to manage and a duty to control that land and anything that's coming from that land. So just in a quick wrap up, the site owner or the duty holder conducted a tank validation and soil analysis at the site, and very happy to say that there wasn't any contamination. But it really was an opportunity for us then to set a baseline for that site. But most importantly, I think it enabled us to also build a relationship with the site and the duty holder. And I think that's what we're finding is really important in the work we're doing at the moment, is that partnership in that prevention of harm focus is really crucial. I might go to the next slide if we can, please. This slide, this story is one that many people talk to and enjoy. I'll just draw your attention to the blue. They're quotes from a media release from the duty holder. So one of the challenging things, this was a scrap metal site that was a well-established business in a regional setting, and it had quite a lot of stockpiling of mixed waste. And you can see there in that first column, the quote from the duty holder, I didn't think it was needed, but it was a legal requirement, so we did it. So the initial challenge that we had was a little bit of resistance to the need for a cleanup and management of the site. The red quote is from one of our regional managers, and this site was dealt with under the fire prevention program. And our manager's quote there says it all: we take a zero tolerance approach to any risk that's not controlled or any non-compliance that we detect throughout that fire prevention program. In short, the duty holder was told to split the piles, given some advice on how that could be done. And the quote there again, it was a legal requirement to split the piles and to put in place a fire plan and a safety management plan, which was done. The interesting thing about this was that we went back and inspected the site and it was compliant and EPA was happy with it. As a matter of about 6 months later, there was a fire at the site, and that was just a bit of friction from one of the machinery working on site, and it started a fire. And because of the work that the owner had undertaken, it was quite easy to separate. I shouldn't say easy. I'm not showing due respect to the people that worked on the suppression, but in terms of the site, it was far easier to pull apart the pile, exposing the hotspots and enabling a faster suppression. And the owner had some interesting comments around, he was amazed to see metal burning. But he also made a quote, gave a quote to the local paper saying that the fire never spread to other piles or threatened the sheds, and that wouldn't have been the case if we hadn't done what the EPA had required. Now, he went on further to say that he would have lost his business if he hadn't done the work that the EPA required. So there's a really great outcome for the community, a great outcome for that duty holder. But I think also another demonstration of how working in partnership, we can change behaviours and we can provide the guidance that really does help people see the benefits of their efforts. And I think that was a great outcome. I can see why everyone loves this case study. And if I can go to the next slide, my final one, and I'll just dash through this. This was a recreational reserve that had contaminated land issues, and the work with EPA commenced under the old Act. But it was around the time that we were starting to rely more on the new Act. So after the completion of the first cleanup plan, there's a bit of a risk assessment done, and the risk was reasonably low. So EPA moved to managing this under the new Act and relied on the duty to manage that comes with the new Act. And again, I think the takeaway there is, again, that communication, that relationship, and that looking for a fair and reasonable, equitable way of dealing with this. Once the risk was low, we went for a way that could be managed to get the best outcome for the community and for the duty holder. And it took away some of the unnecessary administration. But again, we got a great outcome for the community. It was a proportional response, but also we were driving a result and building that trust in the partnership in the way we address the risk. And I might leave it there, noting the time, and throw back to Mark.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. So next slide, thanks, folks. So I'll just quickly dash through a couple of slides here. So we've talked you through sort of the background and where we came from, giving you some examples of what the Act in action looks like, and hopefully that's given you a reasonably representative sample that gives you an understanding of the kind of things we deal with on a day-to-day basis. Just got a couple of slides here on looking forward, some of the things that we're looking at the moment. So end-of-life decommissioning and product stewardship, that's an unusual conversation for the rule-checking entity within the portfolio to be having, but it's a really important conversation for us to be in because we're trying to prevent. So we need to understand the full management system, the full life cycle of the causes of harm in order to maximize the utility of the resources that we've got available to us. And
I'll send them through once. I've got them ready. Do you want me to send them now?
Claire, I think you might just need to put yourself on mute there. Thanks, Claire. One of the things that we're certainly focused on at the moment, to give you an example, is acetylene cylinders. So we're very actively involved in discussions around product stewardship nationally around acetylene cylinders. It's very quickly turning into an international discussion around product stewardship for acetylene cylinders, but it gives you a sense of the change in focus for EPA and the very, very wide-angled lens now we need to apply to the work that we do in order to ensure that we really squeeze every drop of harm prevention value out of this new rule suite that we've got available to us. Also, coag bans. So we're very engaged. Whilst we're not the capacity entity, we now become very, very important to that capacity discussion as online come new technologies, online come new investment profiles, with coag bans coming in the opposite direction mean there is the potential there for stockpiling, there is the potential there for harm. So we're very, very involved in the conversations around the coag bans for tires and plastics and what have you. And we are very focused on Victoria's waterways. Victoria's waterways are the lifeblood of this wonderful state that we find ourselves in. We have no tolerance for any inappropriate activity or any pollution in Victoria's waterways. And we spend, I'm going to speak for and on behalf of Kelly and Rachel here, I'm going to say there's almost half of the work that we do operationally in some way, shape or form will be focused on a potential waterway outcome associated with pollution or waste. It's very important to us. We have a number of programs of work that are very, very focused on Victoria's waterways, including a very dedicated Waterways of the West program that we've stood up over the last 6 months or so. Very focused on agricultural waste. The agriculture sector have done a fantastic job in being prepared for this legislation and in putting systems and processes in place, but it's a very waste generation heavy part of what we do as a society. We see some great things, we see some things that are not so good. And it would be fair to say that within the agriculture sector, there is no aspect of our compliance and enforcement policy or those tools that we explained to you earlier on that we don't get some utility from. It's a very busy space for us. We have no tolerance for fire. We have no tolerance for fire at waste and recycling facilities. We have no tolerance for fire at metal recycling facilities. We have no tolerance for fire in terms of anything that we have any accountability for, we can affect in any way. We share that view very closely with the fire agencies and with our broader DELP portfolio agencies. We have dedicated programs of work that focus very much on the prevention of fire, and Kelly took you through a very good example of the successful application of that. It was from one of those programs that case study came. We do high risk site remediation. We'd love to do none of that. Having said that, we're very proud of the high risk site remediation that we've been involved in. We would rather not have to spend the money that we spend on high risk site remediation in Victoria. And I'm very glad to say already we have seen a fairly significant arrest of significant high risk site locations around the state. Notwithstanding, there is no complacency here. We are very, very focused on that, and we have our eye on the ball very firmly at all points in time around high-risk sites. And priority harms is almost a risk management cottage industry, I would call it. So we are running a priority harm process all of the time. And the reason that we do that is we like to be risk-based, we like to be intelligence-led, and we like to be risk-based in terms of what we do. What that means is we like to be dynamic. So we don't set work programs in place, assume the risk profile around the state will stay exactly the same, and then just do that for 12 months. We set in train work programs that are appropriate for the level of risk and the existence of risk within the environment as known to us at any point in time. When something shifts, we shift with it. So we have very dynamic processes around the assessment and the management of risk. We're very focused on priority harms. What those priorities are for us will shift around, and we will accordingly shift our resource profile. We've still got work to do in that space. It rolls off the tongue quite easily. It's quite a difficult thing to do well. But again, I'm very proud of the distance that we've managed to cover in such a short period of time at being quite dynamic. It is something we always did, but not as systematically as we do it now. So next slide, thank you. So in terms of tracker, I probably won't go into this. The one thing that I will add to what Duncan said earlier on is how it's representative of our very external focus. And indeed, Kate opened with this. We're very externally focused in terms of what we do. We're very connected to community. We're very connected to industry. We're very cognizant of the things that industry and community care about and are trying to achieve. And we try to facilitate those as much as we can. The entire suite of improvements to the waste tracker system has come about as a result of end user desire. It's not making our job any easier. It's quite a challenging project, actually. Duncan, busy with this project, but we're delighted to be able to, and we were delighted to bring this to the board. We were delighted to have the board support this, and we are delighted to be able to do things that help industry to be successful and to achieve by making our systems continually easier to interact with. And as I say, that is representative of the approach that we try to take to everything that we do. It's an interesting job working in a regulator. Nobody in a regulator signs up to be everybody's best friend, but that's not the same as not listening. We are listening all of the time. We are trying to help Victorians to be successful, and we're very mindful of what that looks like on a day-to-day basis. And this is probably the best example that we've got happening operationally at the moment. So next slide, thank you. So this is the final slide that we from the operational team have for you today, which is around continuing to develop our ways of working. So we're very focused on intelligence, data. We're very focused on risk, and intelligence and data are absolutely fundamental to giving us the ability to affect harm to the absolute best of our ability. It's fundamental. As I've said, community information and engagement is very important to us. Over the next 2 or 3 days, we've got about half a dozen community interactions that we're standing up to talk through various environmental issues out and about in the Victorian world. Tasking and coordination, as I say, is always a challenge for us, but it's something we're so there's a little bit inward looking now we're very federated in our approach. Kelly has 4 offices that are working very hard for her. Rachel has 3 separate offices that are working hard for us. We're very, very much about empowering decisions to happen at a local level and ensuring that local contextual information is central to those decisions. Having said that, we're trying to balance that with centralized tasking and coordination so we can take away tasks that are simply much more efficient by managing them centrally. It's an interesting quandary, that one. So it's something we've been doing a lot of work on over the last while, and I suspect we'll work a lot on over the next while. Also, always doing more inspections, continuing to use more tools. Proportionality we've touched on. Proportionality, I suppose, I would talk about it operationally in two ways. We will take actions and use the compliance and enforcement policy in a manner that is proportionate to the risk that's identified. And I've spoken to you a little bit about the way in which we determine for ourselves what that looks like. The other aspect of proportionality, particularly with the newness of the new regime, is state of knowledge. So what people know or ought to have known absolutely factors into our decision making. And perhaps a strong indication of that is our statement of regulatory intent that we published when we went live with the new legislation, that articulated far better than I am in this moment our desire to take actions that are considerate of things like the ubiquitous nature of human error, and that it takes time to learn new things. In speaking to other regulators who've shifted to outcome-based legislation or to duty-based legislation, some will talk to us about a 10-year journey. So it would be a foolish sortie by us to assume on the 2nd of July, we can now assume everybody knows everything and accordingly act, and that's what we've tried not to do. Technology, yes, lots of investment in technology, a very significant transformation program over the last few years, but that continues to evolve. Lots of our systems are being upgraded as I speak to you now. Data and analytics I've spoken to enough, and lots of focus on proactive and complex investigations, including, and I'll perhaps finish with this one, a crime capability that we've not had previously, and that is a very rare skill set for a regulator to have. You start to push very closely towards the policing systems and the judicial systems with the crime capability that we have. We now have under our chief investigator, Ernestina DeMarco, who's also in the operational team, just not with us today, an environmental crime branch that deals with the 5% that can sometimes take up 95% of our time. And quite frankly, the 95% are more adamant about the desire for that 5% to be dealt with than we will ever be, because of pricing regimes and pride in industry, et cetera, et cetera. So it's just another string to our bow. It's extremely complementary to skills and capabilities that we already have. But again, we're very proud of it. So I might leave it there, Mark Taylor. I'm getting tired of the sound of my own voice, so I imagine everyone else is too. I'll leave it there, and I'll hand back over to you. So thank you very much, everyone, for listening to the team today. I really appreciate you taking the time to join us. Cheers.
Thank you. I think I'm back on now. Thank you very much, Mark, for those insightful comments. What I take away from that is that it's very clear now that prevention is the key goal versus perhaps in the past, the focus on the management of pollution at the end of the pipe. From Duncan, Rachel and Kelly, the message I took away that it's very clear that we have much better oversight of waste. It is clear that duty holders know and have to respond to their responsibilities, and that we will hold them to them, and that duty holders indeed have started to shift their behaviours to a much better place in terms of managing pollution and waste. So I'd like now to move us to a panel question and answer session, and I'm going to open it up. I'd like to invite all of our speakers today, Kate Auty, Mark Rossiter, Duncan Pendry, Rachel Galano and Kelly Luffman, to take some questions, and I'll put those to you in a second. And so please, for the audience, please send your questions in. I'll have a few to roll out immediately. So without further ado, and the panel amongst yourselves, I won't direct the questions. I think it might be a good idea that you figure out who would be the best person to answer them. So the first one is, how is EPA be more preventative under the new Act? And this may be one for you, Kate. I will direct actually. Given
Thanks.
that we have less staff overall, higher expectations from community and government, what should industry expect to see in regards to prevention?
Yeah, look, thanks for that question, and it's not unsurprising that it's raised. We've seen a real concentration of effort in the staff that EPA maintain. We've seen some really interesting developments where everybody's pulling together, and in fact the organisational structure encourages that to happen. And in fact, thinking about ourselves as a strategic organisation with the new legislation has meant that we've had to consider a whole range of ways in which we work and which we previously worked. I think one of the really good examples of what's happening with the new structure, with the staffing arrangements that we've got in place, was given by Rachel talking about, or I think it was Kelly talking about, the fire response. We came out of summer last year where we were thinking about that as a really significant critical issue, and we knew we had to do something about it. We set ourselves the zero target, and we can see that in fact some of what's transpired as a result of thinking cleverly, leaning in and making sure that we're doing the job to the best of our ability has meant that we are bringing people along with us. And to have a business that was in fact probably going to find itself in defiance of the way the Act operates, coming to us at the end of it and giving us a very clear heads up that they had achieved the outcome we wanted and that the community wanted, which was to reduce their fire risk, and that it had been the better outcome for their business, is very encouraging. Now, we'll just need to see how this plays out in a range of ways across all of these sectors that Mark Rossiter spoke about, and it won't always be plain sailing, and we'll have to do the work, and we'll have to expect the community and business to come along with us. It's going to be, in a way, a collaborative effort, but we know what our responsibilities are, and we're not in any way stepping away from them. I don't know whether that answers the question about fewer staff, but it certainly tells the person who asked that question that we understand our responsibilities and they are not being dismissed.
Thank you, Kate. And I think it was clear from the statistics that were showed in Mark's team's presentation that we're clearly not shirking from those responsibilities. Mark, do you have any comments to add to that question?
Just I think that shared responsibility is central to the answer. You know, this is the third regulator I've worked for. I can assure you, if I had 1 million staff in each of those regulators, I would have found 1 million people's worth of work. It's actually about maximizing what you've got to have an effect and getting people to want to. And this Act has really given us the ability to do that. So community, they know what they want. They care dearly about the Victorian environment. Industry, they're very connected to their responsibilities. And there are very sound business-based reasons for not wanting negative environmental outcomes, quite aside from the environmental outcomes. So they've got a double bottom line there before we even start. So getting everyone onto the same page to understand what the expectations are, and not being afraid of a lack of specificity and certainty. Because for me, when we approach it on a day-to-day basis, if you're hunting and you're struggling for specificity, then my suggestion would be, whether you're working in a regulator, you're in the community, or you're part of industry, let community expectation be that certainty. And that's the that we take to work.
Just further to that too, Mark Taylor and Mark Rossiter, I mean, Rachel raised the point about how, in fact, using the general environmental duty, not as a stick, but as a carrot as much as anything else, and getting people who are using that to train the contractors means that we will be getting buy-in from people who previously waited for us to come along with the prosecutions and the big stick, saying to themselves that there are ways in which they can be proactive as well. And I think it's pretty clear that the EPA understands, that all of our staff, everybody involved at the EPA understands the legislation gives us the capacity to be proactive in that way. And that is what is happening. And seemingly it's being recognised by the community and business and industry with whom we're working.
Yeah, I think it's very clear that we're on a journey to a new and better place. Partly through the Act, but also through directly the engagement with the community about what needs to be done and why. So if I can follow on from that, I have another question which relates to it. And it states this: what happens if and when there is a disconnect between what an authority and what an EPA seems to be or seems to determine what is reasonably practical with respect to risk. So I guess if I was to distill it, what happens when there's disagreement over reasonably practical?
Yeah, I think, Mark Rossiter, you might want to respond to this or call on one of your team, but just as you do that, we need to be really clear about where this Act takes us, to the extent that we are going to find ourselves making some new law. I think there's no doubt about that from my perspective as a lawyer over some many years. And that being the case, there'll be a lot of conversations about that amongst people who are prosecuting, people who are defending, people who are operating businesses, community members as well, and the EPA. So where there is a disconnect, there will obviously be efforts made to support better outcomes. But Mark, there will also be, out of the investigations branch, other actions taken.
Yeah, absolutely. So to go right to the centre, I suppose, of the question, the answer is probably two things, I would say. The first is something didn't change on the 1st of July last year, and that's the difference between right and wrong. And very often that's what we're talking about when we're trying to determine what's reasonably practicable. It's the line between what's right and what's wrong, and that right and wrong didn't change last year. The other thing I would say is it's happening all day, every day, Mark. It's a new normal. There's a healthiness to it in terms of having those interactions and having those debates around, well, I think this is what constitutes reasonably practicable. Well, I don't think it constitutes reasonably practicable. I think so long as all parties are open and transparent in terms of their views, open to escalation, we're very clear. So Kelly and Rachel are very clear with the team. If it's becoming really strict, let them know. They can escalate to more senior people to have the discussion. We're absolutely open to having that discussion, and we're feeling our way through this. This is kind of the 10-year journey, isn't it? We're feeling our way through this and getting to a point. There will be unintended consequences of such a large-scale policy change, no doubt about it. We've been playing policy whack-a-mole for the last 10 months or so as we create determinations and we come up with regulatory positions in relation to it. There's nothing unusual about that. Every policymaker knows as soon as you shift a large amount of policy at the same time, you will have unintended consequences that you do not see until such time as they start to manifest themselves. And we see some of those things now. But so long as we all stay above the line, we have healthy debates about this, and we're all focused on the same thing, which is strong environmental outcomes, then what we find in the team on a day-to-day basis is that these things have a way of working themselves out. And I, at this point, and we're a good few months in now, have yet to have a single matter, which is a disagreement in relation to what is reasonably practicable, make its way through the system as far as my role. That's not what I expected. I expected I'd have a few of them come to me, and that hasn't happened.
Well, you've answered my question, because I was going to say, what sort of conversations have you had about this? And you've kind of dealt with that and saying the conversation being constructive and positive. I think Duncan wanted to add something here.
Yeah, I think Mark mentioned it before, there's the state of knowledge. And even though each individual happenance is unique, there is usually some example to draw on, and it's as far as reasonably practicable, not what's reasonably practical, as far as reasonably practicable. So there is often while we mightn't have case law, Kate, yet for some of these things, there is plenty of examples of what can reasonably be done in those circumstances to draw on.
So following on from that,
that's an opportunity, just to follow on, Mark, from that. There's a fantastic opportunity for us to craft the future for generations to come. We are so fortunate to be here at this point in time and to be custodians of these rules right now, and they're new, because on a day-to-day basis, we're kind of putting pavers in front of us and walking on them as we go here, and that's just a fantastic opportunity to create a wonderful Victorian environment for future generations.
So, team, in relation to that, one of the listeners has posed the question: how are you testing the GED? Is it through the courts? What's the process that we will be going through in regard to sort of setting the standards for the GED? And I can see Duncan smiling because he knows that's a little curly one.
Before Duncan says anything, we don't have a case in the courts yet about the GED, and I can also see Rachel's probably put her hand up as well, Mark. We don't have a case that's currently being litigated, but that doesn't mean there won't be. And of course, we will make law with this particular duty because it's a novelty to the extent that we are leading. And we need to recognise that in leading, you will always be stepping up to the plate. The reality is that it will be tested in the court, but it will also be tested before we get to there with those conversations about state of knowledge, about whether there's been an uplift in knowledge because of the work that's happened with some of the conversations that Rachel spoke about, which is to do with getting people to think about how they educate their contractors to understand what's required. So under the GED, there's that requirement that you inform. So there'll be a lot of things happening along the way that lead to these conversations before we get to litigation. But litigation will be the test of some of the GED, there's no question about it.
I think that's a fair statement. Now we're leading, but we will be learning as we go and learning how to apply the GED. Duncan or Rachel, you look like you're itching to say something here.
I was just going to say, Mark, that it's really important to understand state of knowledge and the concept of reasonably practicable isn't a static thing. It changes over time as we get new developments in technology, as the industry representatives and industry leaders develop new ways of controlling risk. So we'll always be asking those questions around what's out there. It's not just about the guidance that EPA has, it's also about the standards that are already out there and the examples out there. And part of that, I mean, you may call it disagreement, but there are points through the conversations that we have at that local level and more broadly where you're testing that and you're asking the duty holder to go and look as well because of this concept of shared responsibility as well. So we expect to have those discussions and that's part of our engagement approach and part of working out, well, what is reasonably practicable? And then there are the more formal steps, obviously internal review and testing through the courts, etc. But there's a whole range of tests that go on before that. Thanks.
Yeah, I think Mark, a bit of the GED and its newness too. It's a bit general, no pun intended. There are lots of aspects of what it is that will be tested that have been commonly tested in different regimes. So there are general duties under auspices of other legislation. There is reasonably practicable. There is state of knowledge. There are a number of matters that will have gone through the courts under OH&S is probably the best example. So whilst there's a uniqueness to the application to the environment and public health, actually conceptually as a regulatory construct, it's been tried and tested a number of times.
Thank you. Well, I think I would take from that we have really effectively live legislation and we'll have shifting and improving standards as our knowledge base increases over time. So just because we say something's okay at one particular time doesn't mean to say in 10 years' time it'll still be okay, because as an organisation, science-based organisation, we're gathering and harnessing new information to enhance our decision making. Now, Duncan, did you have anything you wanted to say? Oh, you know, you're good. Okay, I have another question. How does the EPA set its priorities, especially for minimising and responding to the cumulative impact of harm over time? For example, microplastics harming the environment, wildlife and human health. Well, first of all, can I just say on behalf of we don't have any specific legislation for microplastics per se, but there is the new single-use plastics legislation coming in, and microplastics do form part of our research. And at EPA Science, we're understanding the distribution and the harmful effects on, and we had a seminar recently, harmful effects on both the environment and its wildlife, but we're not at the point yet where we're issuing regulation, unless of course it relates specifically to waste. But microplastics in its own right, I do not believe is specifically captured. But Duncan, I can see you looking, you keep picking on you, but you're in front of my screen, you look like you might have something to say there, or can I throw to somebody else?
I'm happy to say just a couple of things. Probably say evidence-led. and I'll hark back to the question Kate answered in terms of our resources and Mark's response. We obviously do not have unlimited resources. So it's a partnership between us and the community and business to get on top of all risks of harm to the environment and public health. So evidence-based in terms of what are the most serious harms that we can see that are potential or actually happening to the environment and public health. So we direct our attention to aim to prevent and stop those. And Mark mentions those areas we're going for in terms of the next little while, in terms of our waterways, any pollution of those waterways and where those sources are coming from. We are interested in tackling particularly with businesses and also with the general community. And agriculture, we mentioned, and obviously fire, which leads to significant pollution of the atmosphere and runoff. So those large topics, we then, in our planning process, we look at where we can go with our people and with our industry-focused areas to get some results, quick wins, as well as looking after long-term programs to try and reduce the impact on the environment over the journey. So prioritisation is really simple in that respect, because we do have a lot of evidence and understanding of a range of pollutants to the environment and public health. But it's changing attitudes and approaches in people and businesses so they care about the environment as much as we do. That's really where the act speaks to for me.
Yeah, and Mark, if I could just make a comment about priorities, because of course in setting priorities we also will always be reflecting back on the principles that guide the objectives to the extent that they're spelled out for us, and they include, you know, the principle of the waste management hierarchy. Well, that will grow and change as we deal with the microplastics, no doubt. There'll be different ways of thinking about the evidence that fits in under that and assists us to make the appropriate decisions in relation to the risks and their management. Evidence-based decision-making, another one of the principles. Polluter pays, another one of the principles. They're all there in the beginning of the legislation in part 2.3, and they will be used throughout to inform what we're doing. So apart from the fact that we know that the ASD and that universities who we partner with will be interested in the research that feeds into making these determinations, we've got those principles which clearly say to us these are all matters that need to be taken into account. Doesn't say, I'm not saying that there will be a prioritisation as a result of that, but they're there and they will need to be factored into all of the conversations about getting to outcomes about that sort of matter in particular.
Thank you, Kate. And I think it's probably fair to say that every citizen of Victoria has a responsibility as part of the GED to minimise and mitigate pollution, including that from microplastics.
And Mark, I might also just add that one of the additions under the Act is the duty to notify contamination, and our response to that is to focus triage, as it were, those reports that are coming in and focusing on those where we've got the highest level of contamination notified to us, and getting the landowner or operator, whoever's the duty holder, to put in appropriate management and mitigation of that contamination. So that's a great result in terms of us being notified and being able to, in a position then to help do something about it.
Thank you very much, Duncan. Okay, we're going to switch type of contaminants here. Arabella from the Clean Air Communities has stated that there is no legislation that protects me from the serious levels of hazardous air pollution from numerous wood heaters that surround my property. How will third-party civil remedies help me, given the sources of pollution are numerous and from numerous households, i.e. my neighbours? Who'd like to have a go at answering that? So I mean, maybe we can ask Kate to step in there, since
I think
our lawyer.
I think we have a winner. That's a tricky question. That is a tricky question.
It's a very tricky question, and
But
it's a very tricky issue.
It's a very important question. I think third-party civil remedies, of all of the newness, is the newest of all. So it's in fact not even live until July this year, and we've been preparing ourselves for third-party civil remedies now for a period of time, albeit really it will be contingent upon what comes when the time comes. We're enormous advocates for third-party civil remedies, and that's because from our perspective, if you think about all the things we've said here today, what does it do? It provides another pathway that has the potential for the prevention of harm, and we're all for that. And so whilst third-party civil remedies may involve questioning some of the decisions that EPA make or questioning some of the policies that are in place, I think, again, it's about having open and transparent conversations about these things and just keeping our eye on the Victorian environmental ball, if you like, so that we're all committed to making it work. How does it specifically apply? I'm less qualified than Kate to give you legal advice in relation to its application, so I certainly won't do so, but perhaps I'll just finish by saying it is just another string in the bow of the EP Act and the facilities that it provides to protect our environment.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks for the question. I'm not going to give legal advice, but we all know that third-party civil remedies are going to be a significant part of the new regime, and we're all waiting to see how that unfolds. We've all watched with interest what's happened in relation to recent litigation by young people in the federal court, and there'll be cases which are determined favourably and cases which are determined unfavourably. And it's really not our place, I suppose, to advise how people might litigate those matters. But I would be very surprised if we don't see an ever-increasing amount of third-party litigation, and it will be made easier by this legislation. There's just no question about that. We recognise that, and we're waiting to see how it unfolds.
Thank you very much, Kate. So let's move to waste, and this question examines or requests some information on waste transport. Who must hold the responsibility? Is it the waste transporter or the waste generator? Can the waste generator transfer the transport risk and responsibility to the transporter to manage?
So the words you use in that question, Mark, if I can lead off, are very important because responsibility and accountability are quite different. So the legislation clearly segments the accountabilities for the generation, the transportation, and the appropriate receipt at a lawful place of waste. It's very clear in its allocation of accountabilities. From a responsibility perspective, can you farm that out? Well, you can make a business arrangement, you can have something in place, and you can have one aspect of that chain perform a function. It is not uncommon for a waste transporter to perform, for example, the waste tracker entry information functions for a waste generator through some form of arrangement that they've got together. That does nothing to alleviate or to take away the actual accountability of that waste generator. So the doing can happen differently depending on the arrangements that are in place, but the accountability will stay squarely with those who are accountable.
Thank you. So there was a question as well. Is EPA going to roll out training in regards to the GED to industry? And the person who wrote the question seemed to think that we were planning to do that. Is that on the agenda? So I would start to answer that question by encouraging you to go to our website, and maybe through the folks who are doing the arranging here, we might send a few links or something afterwards out to help with that. So there is a plethora of information, including video training sessions that you can find on our website that you can use to inform yourself in relation to the GED prior to go live and since go live, actually through a very detailed industry interaction structure that we had. We provided extensive information and training of sorts around Victoria and around Victorian businesses, and we will continue to do so. But your first port of call absolutely is the extensive content that we've got on our website that is fulsome and will help you enormously to understand the GED and the associated responsibilities. Thank you, Mark. That's very helpful. There's a question here which asks, is there an ongoing standing forum or reference group through which the community can express its views and raise issues of concern, or otherwise collaborate on the implementation and understanding of the EPA Act? Well, we do have several community reference groups. We have several occasions when we will refer to the Act and how the Act is applied and the specificity of that Act to a particular location. But does anybody else want to chip in regard to that? I do believe it's probably fair to say that we have a significant outward-facing effort for all of our work. We appear at communities, we talk to the community, we explain what we're doing and why we're doing it and what actions will be taken and why. Cherry Lake being a very good recent example, Kielba will be another.
Yeah. So we've got two types of thing that we do there, Mark, or to the question asker. One is specific to an issue we commonly run we'll run a group, so whether it's Kielba or whatever it might be, specific to an environmental issue, but we also have a community reference group that we run. We're actually going through the process of recasting strategically our entire engagement structure at the moment. So there's been some of the reference groups that we run, they've skipped a turn to allow our comms and engagement folks to work on that strategy and to get that right. But there is no intent to step away from our community engagement and the reference groups that we put in place to ensure we have the voice of the community squarely in our discussions.
Thank you very much, Mark. There's a question here which is sort of for me, but I will also ask others to comment as well. The question states, will the EPA return to integrated collaboration with research organisations and universities to evaluate risk and manage pollution? I think the answer is simply that we're still doing it and we'll never stop doing it, and we'll continue to do it because we work with others who have skills and capabilities that we don't have. But we also do it through strategic partnerships, either through CRCs or ARCs or specific R&D type projects. And specifically, what I would say is that R&D and our research investments are focused squarely on innovative ideas to try and provide new insights to help better regulation, more targeted regulation, so that Mark's team, for example, can actually take the actions or have the information that they need in order to address a particular problem. Does anybody else have any comments in regard to research?
Kate here, from the point of view of the board, I'd just like to say that the board's taken a very active interest in our strategic partnerships because, of course, it's the role of the board to be involved in strategic planning, and we're very keen and very interested in maintaining the relationships that we've held in the past and developing new ones wherever we can with the academics who are coming through with the sort of research that's of use to the EPA, but more generally also in relation to horizon scanning and what might be emerging challenges. So the board has taken a very active role in this and takes a real interest in it.
Thank you, Kate. And there's many topics that we could discuss, but time is short, and I don't want to get derailed by going through the ins and outs of all the research programs that we're undertaking. Now, another question, which is for Mark's team, asks, illegal dumping and storage of waste is an ongoing issue. How does the Act facilitate industry to dispose of waste legally and more easily?
I'm delaying because I've talked so much.
I'm happy to kick it off, Mark. So we've got a whole range of mechanisms to deal with illegal dumping. We've got proactive programs. We have a whole lot of intelligence sharing mechanisms that have been put in place, led by EPA now across various regulators, to share intelligence with WorkSafe, Victoria Police, local councils, and use the data that comes through our pollution reporting system, as well as engagement with industry, to be able to better detect and prevent environmental crime, illegal dumping in particular. There's also a Recycling Victoria program that EPA are tasked with delivering on, which involves preventing and managing high-risk sites and just really increasing our focus on environmental crime. And so earlier Mark mentioned and Kate mentioned our new chief investigator, with all our specialist investigators that have significant law enforcement backgrounds, surveillance, and other activities that we do, they work really closely with Kelly and my team. And there's a couple of hundred people in that group, and we all work collaboratively and also undertake things like disruption operations. If we know there's a particular geographical area where there's a lot of illegal dumping, we will plan out operations with other regulators to address those issues. But importantly, it's not just about the site. We also look at the entities and the individuals involved so that we monitor their activities moving forward to prevent them setting up somewhere else. So these new powers under the environment protection legislation really enable us much more than ever to be able to deliver on that. So hopefully that answers the question.
That's excellent. Can I follow up and harass you with another question to give Mark Rossiter and the others a rest? Somebody's written in and asked, will the EPA be changing the triage system for investigations? And this follows on, of course. That being only investigating issues once there have been multiple notifications from the community. Other agencies, such as the local government, don't use this method. And I think that's probably a little bit unfair. And I think it'd be important to cast some light on this about how we deal with particular issues. And related to that, if I can roll in the same question as our final question, because we've got less than 5 minutes left. What size spills must be reported to the EPA under the Act? 1 litre, 100 litres, or 1,000 litres? So at what point do we intervene? Is it through multiple complaints, or and what's the quantity, as it were? And of course, it depends on the substance, but I'll let the team give an answer to this.
So the answer is it depends on the substance, Mark. So we could get 1,000 phone calls in relation to something that doesn't necessarily pierce the harm threshold that would not trigger us to do anything other than stakeholder engagement in relation to complainants. So we could receive a phone call that would immediately set the entire machinery of the EPA in motion, or anything in between, and all of that happens on a day-to-day basis. Perhaps the best way to answer this is just to point back to the conversation that we've had for the last hour and a half or so around our priority focus on the prevention of harm. So where we will allocate our finite resources is where we will get the best bang for buck in terms of the minimization of harm. Sometimes so as it's about investigations, the investigation might be to determine what specifically harm we can prevent, and sometimes we may activate an investigation with a view towards firm prosecution and holding to account. But we're not actually in the business of prosecution. It's just one thing that we do. It's not our primary goal. We're always focused on the public interest, and we're always focused on things like general deterrence when we're making those decisions. So I am the person or the role within EPA who makes decisions about who we should legally pursue. And these are the things that I'm thinking about as I make these individual decisions about who it is that we should be investigating and or prosecuting. So back to where I started, it's about the prevention of harm, and it's about whether or not the initiation of an investigation we're convinced will sufficiently prevent harm in the future. It's not there's no direct correlation with number of phone calls or number of community members.
Thank you.
I just might like to thank the person for asking that question, because we've never assessed whether we should respond based on the volume of information coming in. So we receive about 20,000 calls a year on those lines of pollution reports, and we have a triage system in place to determine what our response will be, from immediate to perhaps just directing a message back to the caller about what that was about. So it was a low-level thing. So depends on how we assess the risk of harm, or the harm to environmental public health, as to what level of response. And if it's serious, we will respond within hours and be out there.
Thank you very much indeed. We can't be all things to all people all the time, and we have to apply a risk-based approach to our decision making in order to spend the money in the best possible way to get the biggest impact, as we've heard all afternoon. So I'd like to thank you. I'd like to thank absolutely everybody on this call, including the listeners and attendees, and particularly the production team and the other staff at EPA who've worked furiously behind the scenes to pull this together. It's all we have time for today. We've had some terrific questions. If we haven't been able to respond to your question during this session, please send through your contact details so that we can respond to you later. The contact details should be contact@epa.vic.gov.au. I'd like to thank everybody once again, specifically our guest speakers and our subject matter experts, Professor Kate Auty, Mark Rossiter, Rachel Guilano, Duncan Pendry, and of course, Kelly Luffman, and to all of you attendees for joining us today to hear about what EPA's work is doing in preventing harm from pollution and waste. We encourage all attendees to champion environmental protection under the General Environmental Duty, and we look forward to sharing further successes of our new Act in action into the future. Thank you very much for attending.